developing models and inference tools to analyze interaction data. She also focuses on untangling causal mechanisms that govern fusion dynamics to quantify heterogeneous effects of intervention in connected communities. So welcome, Maggie. I look forward to getting you guys today.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Also, thank you for having me. I was just telling people that I graduated from UMass Amherst. This is where I got my undergrad from, so I could not be more excited about being here. It really feels like a homecoming. All my first memories of being in the United States are here, so I'm really excited about it. That being said, I'm here to talk to you about work that I've done with my advisor, John Guttag at MIT, and Professor Jenna Wiens at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, as well as collaborators from Massachusetts General Hospital. All the work that I'm going to present it in terms of spread of infectious diseases, but the ideas and the concepts that are at the core of these algorithms are very much generalizable to any spread of any rumor type things on social networks or viral posts and things of that sort. So before jumping in, I want to take a very kind of long jump back into the 1900s. Do people know who this is? Yes, no? No, okay. So back in the 1900s in New York, there was a series of outbreaks of typhoid fever. And one investigator, his name is George Soper, he followed these outbreaks, some of these outbreaks, and following the trail of breadcrumbs, and he found out that there's one person that is in common with all these outbreaks. And she was a woman whose name was Mary Mallon. She was a cook. And every time she moved from one place to the other, people tended to get sick. Now, the really weird thing is that she looked completely healthy. She looked like nothing was wrong with her, none of the typhoid symptoms. And it turns out that Typhoid Mary, as she later got called, was the first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid, which just means that she was carrying the pathogen, spreading it around, but she looked like she was fine and healthy. Now, if you're willing to engage in a thought process that I like to engage in, what would I have needed to help George Soper way back in the 1900s in New York to help him predict who's going to get infected? So if I putting my 1900 New York hat on, what I would need to know, give me a New Yorker, pick a random New Yorker, and I want to predict whether or not they'll get infected. He will get infected. What I need to know about him is who has he come in contact with? Who has he talked to? Who has he had dinner with? His network of contents. That's one thing. The other thing that I would like to know is, are these people sick? Did they get tested and test positive for typhoid? And the other thing that I want to know is, are any of them Mary Mallon? Are any of them asymptomatic carriers of typhoid? And that's a hard thing to know without testing everybody that New Yorker comes into contact with. Now, those two factors help me find out about the exposure to typhoid. Has this New Yorker been exposed to the pathogen? The other thing that is very important to know is, what is this New Yorker's characteristics? Because you can think of situations where someone shares quarters with Mary Mallon, and she cooks in his kitchen, but that person exercises really good hand hygiene, or they have an immune system that is beast mode, kills every pathogen that comes in their body. So I also want to know about that New Yorker's immunity and how good he is at repelling those pathogens. Now, why am I talking about all of this? It seems like it's a little dated. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there are diseases that exist to our day that are problematic in our healthcare system that have a lot of characteristics that are similar with this typhoid problem. One of them, and the motivation behind this work, is caused by a bacteria called Clostridium difficile, or C. diff. C. diff attacks our guts, so it attacks the GI system. And it attacks roughly 250,000 Americans every year. And it's really nasty. It causes a very severe diarrhea. It causes something called toxic megacolon, real inflammation of the colon. And in some very serious cases, this causes mortality. And despite physicians' best efforts, this continues to be a problem with the healthcare system, causing excess medical costs of something like $1 billion. One of the reasons, at least, why this is still a problematic disease is because we don't know how to predict this well. We don't have a good risk assessment tool to tell us which patients are more likely to be infected. For reasons that are very similar to why it is hard to model typhoid or to model infection for typhoid. So C. diff is multifactorial. It depends on two things: susceptibility of the host and exposure to the contagion. So I not only need to know if someone's been exposed, I need to know about their health. And it's not obvious to us, we don't still know how the two factors interact with each other. Like if you tell me it's only important to make sure that like people are not exposed to C. diff, because once you're exposed, that's it, done, you're gonna get infected, I will preemptively isolate people, put them in quarantines, make sure they don't touch each other. But if you tell me it doesn't really matter, a little bit of exposure will kind of like get you if your health is bad. But if you have good immune system, then it's fine. A little bit of exposure won't hurt you. In that case, I would kind of like preemptively put people on broad, narrow spectrum antibiotics, things that like specifically fight C. diff. But we don't know that. We don't know which is more important. The other thing is that people like Mary Mallon, or like the analogous in C. diff, exist. There are asymptomatic carriers of the disease who carry the pathogen but look normal. They don't display any of the symptoms. And like a rough estimate of where or what % of the population is an asymptomatic carrier goes somewhere from like 5 to 20%. So this could be like a real issue. And right now, people, like the majority of research assumes that only infected people, only people who have tested positive for C. diff are people who are spreading the pathogen, which we know is not true. Okay, so what do we do? Our approach was we are going to take both the observed network of contact, which in our case was a hospital setting, like which patients shared a room, which patients came into contact with each other. We're going to take that, we're going to assume it's observed, assume I observed the network of contact, and I'm going to also take into account the patient's characteristics, which we have through EHR records. And I'm going to combine the two to try to like follow the trail of breadcrumbs like George Soper did, but on a larger, more automated scale, to find who could be an asymptomatic spreader or asymptomatic carrier of C. diff, and who is more likely to get infected. And in the process, I would like to learn how the two factors, like exposure and susceptibility, interact together to cause infection or to be associated with infection. So in our network, every node is a patient, or every node is an individual. And edges are defined in different ways. We tested different definitions, like either if two patients share the same nurse on the same day, there's an edge between them, or if two patients share the same room on the same day, there's an edge between them. So specifically what we did was we came up with a graphical model to learn the probability of activation or infection in the presence of latent spreaders, which we shorten with PALS. And this is what it looks like. So for patient I, their infection state depends on an exposure state, which is a binary variable. And we assume this exposure state is unobserved, it's latent, in combination with their own characteristics. So this is like their EHR record, their medications, characteristics specific to the patient themselves. And a set of learned weights which tell us how exposure states and the characteristics map onto an infection state. So the hope is once we're done doing inference, we can look at this W, this set of weights, and it will tell us how different factors are important in mapping from like the characteristics and the exposure state onto the infection. So this would tell us the relative importance of exposure and susceptibility. And this exposure state is a function of some aggregate function of all my neighbor's states. So the neighbor's spreader state is also a latent variable, and this theta is some kind of aggregation of these latent variables. And if you notice here, every neighbor of mine, so I have for patient I, they have Ni neighbors, and every one of them has a different spreader state. The spreader states are also dependent upon the neighbor characteristics, as well as a set of learned weights that tell us how different characteristics of the patient make them more likely to spread the disease or not. The kind of like interesting thing to notice here is that all, like the infection state and the spreader states are both functions of characteristics, not functions of the network. And this is a useful property because we can study dynamic networks. Like if I say, okay, a spreader is someone who has a lot of degrees, like they are very well connected to everybody. This means that if I have a new network, I'll have to look at just degrees. I won't be able to like find out anything interpretable or anything meaningful about the patient's state that would make them spreaders or not. And the other thing, it helps with interpretability. Like I can look at various factors and see, oh, if this patient, like let's say we learn that patients who are younger than 30 are really likely to be spreaders. Then if someone comes into the hospital and they're younger than 30, then I will try to like not have them mix with the rest of the population. Oh, go ahead.
I would have expected to see YJ
Mm-hmm.
in the neighbor characteristics.
It does. I end up grouping it in the characteristics. Yes. Yes. And actually, yes. So one of the qualitative conclusions that we kind of like found out from the analysis has a relevance to that, and I will point it out when we get to it. Okay, so this is cool. This is our graphical model. I need to learn U and W, and I need to learn the latent variables. The problem is these latent variables tend to scale up exponentially with the number of neighbors that I have. So it becomes like computationally difficult to, computationally intractable. So what are we going to do? We're going to do approximate inference. So I'm not going to like really get into the details of variational inference, but we'll kind of like cruise through it. And this is the method of inference that we used. So very quickly, variational inference says, okay, my posterior is too hard to learn. I'm going to say, let me find another set of probability distributions that are easy for me to compute, and I'm going to find one probability distribution within those set of like easy to compute probability distributions that is as close as possible to my true posterior, and closeness here is measured with the KL divergence. The direction of the arrow is significant because the KL divergence is not symmetric, so we are measuring the KL divergence from the latent or the approximate distribution to our true posterior. And it ends up like the one thing that you can kind of like, there's one thing that you should know is that it turns the problem into an optimization problem. So I'm taking derivatives with respect to all my parameters. Our variational approximation looks something like this. So I'm going to assume independence. I'm going to assume that every one of the distributions over my latent variables is independent of the other. So everything multiplies. And every one of the distributions is governed by a parameter that's its own parameter. It's not shared by anything else. So the neighbor spreader states are Bernoulli draws, independent Bernoulli draws parameterized by phi. The neighbor's influence is a beta draw, and it's parameterized by a vector, gamma. And the patient's exposure is another kind of a Bernoulli draw, parameterized by pi. Now, in order to find the posterior over these, we're going to take derivatives with respect to the parameters. Something that I find interesting is like the interpretation of the phi parameter, the parameter that tells us if my neighbor J is likely to be a spreader. So we find that it is proportional to neighbor J's intrinsic probability of being a spreader. That's like the probability based on their own characteristic. And also proportional to some function of this individual's likelihood of being exposed. So the higher the likelihood that this individual is exposed, the higher the likelihood that this neighbor is a spreader. And the last interesting thing is that it's inversely proportional to how the other neighbors of I are. What is their spreader state? So if I find one patient that is very likely exposed, but I also know that all his other neighbors are spreaders, this puts less blame on me, neighbor J. So this is kind of like assigning blame according to how the other neighbors are as well. Okay, so this is sort of like the interesting part about the inference. There's also like the other two parameters are also interesting, but their description is in the paper. This is like my favorite part. So there's that. So now we want to test how our model does. We kind of like, now we know the generative model, we kind of know how the inference goes, and now we want to like see how it works. The problem is based on our hypothesis at the beginning, we don't want to assume that I can observe everybody's spreader states. So I want to allow some spreader states to be unobserved. So no real data set, no matter how good it is, will give me that kind of information. So that's why we decided to go with simulated data at first, and then we'll generalize to, we'll look at the application itself. So the simulated data, I'm simulating the spreader state, so I can tell how good I am at predicting spreaders because I have the ground truth. So we're going to measure the performance of our model on 2 tasks. The first is how good am I at predicting that a person is going to get infected, and the second thing, how good am I at finding out where my Mary Mallons are, where my typhoid Marys are, or how good am I at finding those spreaders. We're going to go through a bunch of these kind of tests, but I will only bring up 2 of them. One is I want to ask the question how well does my model pick up on this exposure? So if exposure is really important, is that something that my model is able to incorporate? And the other thing that we wanted to look at is what happens as I incorporate knowledge. Let's say I know for a fact that this subpopulation is a spreader. I don't want to assume that everybody is a latent spreader. I have some existing knowledge about who might be, and I want to incorporate it in my model. Can I do this flexibly, and what does that give us? OK, so first question is how well do I pick up on importance of exposure? So if exposure is more important, is that something that I'm able to gauge? So on the x-axis, I'm going to sweep over the probability of exposure conditioned, the probability of infection conditioned on exposure. So on this side, you have something that's like a non-communicable condition at all, like a broken bone. You don't catch a broken bone from someone. And then on the other side, you have something that's incredibly contagious, like the flu. And on the y-axis, I have the mean AUC, and it's going to be the mean AUC for the 2 different tasks. So these are our results. The blue line shows me a model, the performance of a model that completely ignores the networks. It just goes I will just try to predict your infection state based on your own characteristics. And the important detail that I failed to mention is that I'm holding the probability of infection conditioned on susceptibility as 0.5 this entire time. So here you have the probability of infection conditioned on exposure is 0.5, and the probability of infection conditioned on susceptibility is also 0.5. So infection state is basically a coin flip. So this is the model that completely ignores, blue line is the model that completely ignores the network or completely ignores exposure. The green line is an oracle that kind of cheats by having access to the ground truth spreader states. So it gets to see who is a true spreader and who is not, which is an unrealistic setup in our situation. And the red line is our models. And it shows that as exposure becomes more important, our model is able to incorporate that, and it gives us better information or better accuracy about who is more likely to be infected. This is the mean AUC on the y-axis, so averaged over 30 simulations. The other task that we wanted to look at was how good are we at finding Mary Mallon? How good are we at finding those spreaders? So the green line is a simple logistic regression that takes in the characteristics of the patients and spits out a training time. It has access to the ground truth label of the spreader states, and it's just spitting out predictions for who is more likely to be a spreader. This is more or less to just give you an idea of how hard the task is. So we see that as the probability of infection conditional on exposure increases, we get better and better at identifying who these spreaders are. And at first glance, it was wait, that's not a good thing. I want to be able to identify the spreaders at all times, which is actually not the case. Because if there are people who are kind of carrying the contagion and not spreading it around because exposure doesn't really matter in that disease, then it's fine. They can live the way they are. I don't really care to identify them. There might be cases where these people are biologically interesting to study, and in that case, this kind of model would not be very helpful to identify them because you're not going to be able to find them by following kind of the breadcrumbs. You won't be able to look at their neighbors and be oh, they're all infected, so you might be the culprit here. So this kind of model would not help us find that out. The other question that we had is, okay, the assumption that everybody is latent, everybody's a latent spreader, I know nothing about anybody, is a little bit harsh. Like maybe I have some information, maybe I tested some people, like Professor David was saying. Maybe I've tested some people and I already know that these people aren't infected. So let me try to incorporate that into the model. Here I'm incorporating that as a label. Like I'm assuming that, let's go all the way back. Here, yes. So I'm going to say that this is observed. If that makes sense. So this becomes their outcome. It becomes their Y. So that's how I'm incorporating that information. Here we go. Okay. So again, blue line is something that completely ignores the network. Green line is something that knows all, like 100% of the true spreader states. And the red line is our model. The purple line is something that takes in, like here it's taking in 0% of the true labels. Here it's like taking 25% of the true labels, and so forth. So I'll basically like randomly pick 25% of the population and give this model access to those labels, and it assumes that everybody else is not a spreader. So it assumes 0 for everybody else. So we see that our model does better because it's assigning a non-zero probability to everybody else who I don't see. It's assigning a non-zero probability of being a spreader. So it ends up like getting better, better accuracy. So the takeaways here are we're able to some extent like incorporate exposure in a meaningful way. It helps us identify who the infected patients are. And it also helps us identify who the spreaders are. And we're able to also incorporate flexibly knowledge about the spreader states of the patients. We have some additional results in the paper that talk about like the network sparsity. So the structure of the network, is it very dense or is it very sparse? This is all drawn from a stochastic block model. So you have a higher, stochastic block model basically says I have a higher likelihood of forming an edge with people who are in my unit or my group, and a smaller probability of forming an edge with people who are not in my group. So we kind of play with these parameters, and it seems like the model is robust to these kind of changes. Okay, the cool part, experiments on real data. So we had data from a large hospital, EHR records. We have room and nurse information. And again, our task is I want to identify who's going to get infected with C. diff and who is a spreader. And the kind of information that we have on everybody is your typical like EHR records. We have medication, we have history of medications, we have procedures done up until some point in the hospitalization. And we have whether or not a patient has tested positive for C. diff. We tried different formulations of the network, like how do I define the network? Do I define it through nurse sharing, or do I define it in terms of room sharing? And we tend to get better results with the nurse sharing, just because the room sharing, there's some kind of noise in the data. Sometimes like the patients will be in the hallway, and I don't really know which room that is. So it's hard to gauge where they've been. As you can tell, the room network is a lot more sparse than the nurse network because people don't change rooms that often. They change nurses, or like the same nurse will administer drugs to like different patients, so that network becomes a little bit more dense. And in general, the percent outcome is roughly 1.5%, so the percent of people who get C. diff within their hospitalization. And we have around 20,000 patients. We split them evenly into training and testing. So the bottom line is we do better. Otherwise, the slide would be here. So we test against a bunch of benchmarks. I'm only showing some of them here for brevity, but we test against a benchmark that's just a logistic regression, taking in the patient characteristics and trying to predict whether or not they get infected. We test the second model, something that only assumes that observed CDI patient, observed C. diff patients are capable of spreading. Nobody else. There are no asymptomatic spreaders. We also run our model assuming that everybody's a latent, could be a spreader. I don't know anything about any spreading information about anybody. And we also incorporate, like if someone tested, like here, we have that roughly 9%, for example, in the training set got tested for C. diff. So whether or not they tested positive or negative, I kind of, like if they have gotten a test, I assume that their spreader state is no longer latent, and I can observe it. And it turns out that the model that incorporates that partial information based on the nurse network has a higher, statistically significantly higher AUC than the other models. This is based on 1,000 bootstrap replicates of the test set. Now, the interesting thing that I was kind of referring to earlier is we can look at these parameters that we've learned. We can look at the parameters that kind of map from, oh, sorry, yes. So latent spreader is someone who is carrying a pathogen, but they are not obviously sick. So it's kind of like Typhoid Mary. She didn't have a fever, but she was carrying the pathogen and she was spreading it around. Yes. So if not everybody, so in our application, in the case of C. diff, not everybody get tested for C. diff. Only if they start developing symptoms, they get tested. So everybody else, I don't know what their true state is. And it turns out there are a lot of people who are carrying the pathogen and never get tested, but are spreading the pathogen around. Yeah, I think it can be applied to any kind of, not even a disease. Like if you think of rumors spreading on Facebook, like I could be behaving some way on Facebook. I have connections on Facebook, but in private, I am also talking to my friend, telling her like, oh, have you heard about this new rumor? Have you heard about this and that? So I'm kind of like swaying her offline, and you cannot tell from my behavior online that I am spreading this rumor because I never shared it. The methodology would be the same. Yes, correct. Yeah. Then yes, the numbers based on the different application would be different. Correct. Okay. All right. So so we took our medical data set, ran our model, ran our inference, and we kind of post hoc analyzed the two sets of parameters that we learned, the parameters that map us onto the infection state and the parameters that map us onto the spreader state. The interesting thing that we found is that patients who are on broad spectrum antibiotics tend to be spreaders, which at first I was like, wait, if you're on antibiotics, you're spreading. That's kind of like counterintuitive. But our medical collaborators were like, yeah, this makes complete sense because broad spectrum antibiotics tend to kill bacteria in the gut that are useful for fighting C. diff. They're not targeted to C. diff. They're killing bacteria in the gut in general. So patients who are on broad spectrum antibiotics tend to be spreaders. The other thing is patients who are being treated for diarrhea tend to be spreaders. And this also makes sense because C. diff tends to spread through the fecal-oral route, which means that someone goes to the bathroom and your food is sitting next to them or something. There's like fecal contamination and someone eats that food. Then they get the infection. So it makes sense that someone with diarrhea is spreading a lot more than someone without diarrhea. I try to think of ways of saying this without sounding gross, but I guess the moral of the story is don't eat in hospitals. But yes, the really interesting part is that I do incorporate in the characteristics, whether or not, only the characteristics of the spreaders. So I look at whether or not the person has been infected with C. diff. Have they tested positive? And it turns out that patients who test positive for C. diff do not spread the disease. And this kind of also makes sense because once a patient is identified as a C. diff positive patient, the hospital that we're working with does like a lot of precautionary measures. The room gets bleached. If enough patients in that unit get the infection, the entire unit gets bleached. They're immediately placed in isolation. Sometimes they're placed in isolation even a little bit, like once you start showing the symptoms, even before the test comes back, you're placed in quarantine. So this is telling us, like, hey, by the way, these precautionary measures are actually useful. So I think I'm really good on time. So to sum up, we created this graphical model that is applied here to infectious disease, but is more general than that. It can model any kind of infection where you want to model the infection state based on characteristics of the node as well as exposure to pathogens from outside the host themselves. In future work, actually this doesn't say here, but in future work we want to, so we assumed how to aggregate the neighbor states into a single exposure variable. It's not very obvious how to do that. Like, let's say I have 5 or 4 neighbors, 2 of them are spreaders. This model would tell us that my probability of being exposed is 0.5. But that's not necessarily true. Like, it could be the case that only 1 infected neighbor is enough to get me sick. So that's what I'm currently working on. Like, let's lift this assumption about like how influence functions are, how other people influence me, and see what happens. We also, so all of the analysis here was done on a snapshot of, like a non-temporal snapshot of the network. So at a given point in time, I freeze everybody and I say, okay, now if I want to create a prediction for everybody, how would I give different predictions? Something else that we want to look at is how things evolve over time, like how a patient's infection state or their susceptibility state or their even spreader state evolves over time within the hospital. The other thing that's like my research dream is to look at the causal mechanisms. This is all associations. None of this stuff, like I haven't tested the important kind of causal assumptions. And what I'm really interested in is to look at how the causal model, the causal version of this model works. I think that is it. Yeah, thank you.
I just have a question on the label that you use to say that someone was infected with C.
Mm-hmm.
You said you freeze the snapshot in time,
Mm-hmm.
and then you try to make a prediction whether all the people will be infected or not.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the important things in medical domain I was told was to predict within which time will they be affected.
Yeah.
If someone's going to be affected in a year, you don't need to predict that because they're not going to
If someone's going to be infected in what?
in a year or something.
Oh, in a year, okay.
They're not going to be in the hospital, so
Yeah.
you don't need to predict that. So you could consider them a negative label.
Yes.
Do you have a time limit within which you predict?
Yes, that's a great question. So C. diff has different kinds. There is community-acquired C. diff, and then there's hospital-associated C. diff. So community-acquired means I come in the hospital, and I'm already kind of colonized. I have the bacteria in my gut. And there's the other kind, which is I come in the hospital healthy, or not healthy, but with a different kind of problem, and then I end up getting C. diff because I came into the hospital. We were interested in the second type. We were interested in people who get the infection in the hospital, because that's like the preventable case. Like I can control their environment. So we looked at patients after day 5 of their hospitalization, so long hospitalizations. Day 5, someone gets infected. So I freeze everybody on day 5 of their hospitalization, and I try to predict if they're going to get C. diff within this hospitalization. Obviously, like I also drop patients whose visit is like 5 days, because I'm not going to predict for like the next hour or so. And I also drop any patients who have gotten the C. diff infection prior to that 5-day mark. So I don't want to predict someone that I already know has C. diff. But it turns out like these populations are, like it's still a large enough population. It's still like 1% of the patients who get that infection. Does that sort of?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, you raise a good point. It could be true that a patient walks out and then tomorrow gets C. diff, and I wouldn't, like if they go to a different hospital other than the hospital that we were working with, I would not know. So that's kind of like I'd be myopic to that outcome. But yeah.
So how long does your model take to predict the spreader or so when you're reading snapshot?
How long in terms of like wall clock time? I think it would take like, to be also kind of the computational resources that I'm working, like I'm not working with like massive CPU clusters. All this data sits on the hospital's servers, so they're not, like the computational resources that I have are not huge. So it takes about like 15 minutes to run. But if I assume that if you try to do something like MCMC with this, it would take a lot longer. Like we would sit there for a long time until it converges. But yeah, that's roughly the time. Yes.
So were you able to like test like the usual containment or isolation protocols, or did you also come up with new containment protocols or cleaning like
So we don't have data about cleaning in our data set. That's something that we would have loved to have, and it's a conversation that we had a lot with our collaborators. Like, can you tell me when this unit was bleached? No. So we don't have containment information. I can see when a patient is being moved to, like in the data set, I can see if a patient is being moved to a different room, but I don't know what's being cleaned. Our collaborators are really excited to get working on new interventions, like you kind of alluded. Okay, this is great. Can I now intervene? But I have been like, let's look at the causal factors here, because if this is all kind of spurious correlations, intervening on making sure that nobody gets a broad spectrum antibiotic might not lead to anything, because it's not a causal factor. It's just simply an association with the outcome. So I hesitate to say, oh, let's intervene on this, until I'm like, okay, this is the causal structure that we're playing with. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm really excited to kind of move on to the causal domain here. I think someone else said.
So I've got a question about evaluation.
Okay.
So you do two routes to evaluation. One is synthetic, and one is empirical.
Mm-hmm.
And in the synthetic case, I'm always more convinced when I see it tested against a simulator that the researcher did not write.
Oh, yes.
Are there simulators out there that you can test against that would give you the network and give you the sort of epidemiology on it?
Not to my knowledge. And I think the reason is what we were doing is a little bit maybe too specific. There are things out there that will, using the network structure, will try to predict who is a spreader, who's the hidden culprit. I'm setting these models up to fail if I'm comparing them against my simulations. Because in my simulations, I know that susceptibility is important. It's not you cannot gauge the whole, the node-specific characteristics are important. So if I give you an algorithm that will only look at the network structure and give me who's likely to be infected, I'm kind of giving myself a very good leg up. But if people know about benchmarks that I'd be happy to run them against them.
And so the second one is on the empirical thing. You mentioned it could apply to social media or something else.
Mm-hmm.
Any prospects for getting a data set where you would know the ground truth of, maybe revealed later or something?
Oh my gosh, even if I don't, I'll take a data set without even people, it's becoming even more difficult with all that's been going on to get access to Facebook data. Yes, for reasons that are very, very reasonable. But it's, I don't know if there is there might be situations where, okay, I know the ground truth of everybody, but for some reason I expect that there will be some applications where some of the labels will be hidden from me, so then it'd be good to do that. But it doesn't seem like it would fit with the some people are latent spreaders type of. John, you had a question?
Did you notice any patterns with the nurse network that had an influence on the patients associated with the nurses being spreaders? So a nurse that had a lot of patients more likely to...
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't look at that, no. But something else that we are just starting to work on is we have the blueprints of the hospital. So we can tell when a nurse, I know it's the coolest thing. So the one question that kind of gets at what you're saying is you get these nurse stations which are hubs. So I was very interested to see okay, if there are two hubs, one big unit and it's it's two central places, the nurses can go either here or here, versus there's one main hub where everybody's kind of giving all the pathogens on the The interesting thing is that C. diff can live outside of the host for a while, so it can live on surfaces. That's another reason why rooms are weird as a connection, because it can live on the surface for, we don't know how, months. So that's and the interesting thing is that people don't know exactly how long it lives on these surfaces. And it's not if a patient presents, I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but this is one of the difficulties of working with this disease, is that if the patient will present symptoms, I don't know how long they've had the pathogen. So I can clean up their room, but what about the 5 other rooms that they've been in the last week? Do I need to clean that up too? And they, right now, the room where the patient was in when C. diff was observed or tested, that's the room that gets cleaned up, but just don't tell me. But no, I have no, to answer your question in a very convoluted way, no, I have not looked at the particular patterns, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. Yeah.
The second question was going to be about time for exposure to presenting symptoms.
Yeah, so on average, it's 3 days. So we have some average for that, less so with how long does the pathogen, like we don't know the answer of like how long does the pathogen live on like hard surfaces. We know that on average, people present symptoms 3 days before they test positive.
So less information on social networks can resurface.
Mm-hmm.
What is the frequency of seeding?
Resurfacing? Not in the same hospitalization. It's a very hard pest to get rid of. So people will get readmitted for the same disease a lot of times. I don't know the exact frequency, but within a single hospitalization, we assume that once infected, always infected for the rest of the hospitalization. So I don't look again for these patients to kind of like track, oh, they're out of quarantine, they're somewhere else now.
Okay, so just follow up on that. So A and B are in each other's network.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first pass, A is not infected.
Mm-hmm.
And then B gets infected, and eventually B gives it back to A.
That's not, yeah.
You observe that, or you?
So then in that case, so you said A gets infected first.
No, A is free, A is good.
A is good.
B gets infected.
And then,
In the second pass, B gives it back to A.
so in that case, they both be each other's neighbors. And they're both treated, like I almost create copies of the patients, a copy that's an individual and the copy is like a neighbor. So it depends on where you freeze time. So, yeah.
The aspect is missing, so
Yes. No, so we don't look over time. It's frozen. At day 5,
okay.
A will be B's neighbor and B will be A's neighbor. And I will freeze their characteristics. So let's say, I'm going to mess dates now. Let's say A got infected on January 15th. I will freeze all of A's neighbors and their characteristics as they were on 2 days before, I think. So like I'll freeze them here and I'll try to find which one of them are spreaders. Same goes for B. If B gets infected on like January 30th, or forget, no, you said 1st. So January 10th, yeah, I'll freeze everybody at that time. Yeah. But the temporal evolution is something that we really wanted to look at, and we're hopefully going to do that soon. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
So, trying to figure out how relational the inference process is. So,
Yeah.
if for patient 1,
Mm-hmm.
they have a neighbor,
Mm-hmm.
and they only have one neighbor,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And they get infected.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at the neighbor and say, neighbor probably has, should have really high spreader status.
It depends. Because if patient 1 is really, really, really susceptible,
Let's say they're not.
let's say then yes, I will assign blame.
So we can probabilistically assign blame to that one neighbor.
Yes.
And importantly, that one neighbor is also the neighbor of somebody else.
The-
Does that now propagate?
Yes, because it all kind of like feeds back into the sink of that function that takes me from the characteristics to the spreader. So I will say, let's say in the 2 situations, when I'm doing inference with patient 1, that neighbor is very likely a spreader. And that with patient 2, maybe not, because patient 2 didn't get sick. Is that not the situation that you're saying?
Well, what I'm trying to figure out, when you said you create copies, I got
Yes.
worried.
Yes. No.
Because you want that information to propagate.
Yes, so it propagates by feeding back into the same place, which is the functional mapping from the character. So that patient, that neighbor that we're trying to figure out if they're a spreader or not, has the same characteristics. So the characteristics are set.
Right.
So it will feed back into learning the mappings from the characteristics to the spreaders.
Okay.
Okay.